Liam, host of East Bay Yesterday, a critically acclaimed podcast here in the East Bay. Also, Liam, co-creator of the long lost Oakland map, which if you haven't seen, I do highly recommend you go out and take a look at it, if not purchase it. So with that, Liam.
Oh, thank you. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk about Oakland and other East Bay books right now, because as an amateur historian, I try to do a lot of, original research, interviewing people, gathering information, etc. But so much of what I do, I rely on previous historians and previous authors for. So I've got a giant stack of books here that I want to run through. It's pretty diverse. Just said, I figure people on this call will have all kinds of different interests. So I want to cover a lot of bases. I'm going to, probably spend about 30 seconds to a minute on each book for, about maybe the next 20 minutes, half hour or so, and answer some questions that already came in through the RSVP form. And then I'll open it up to you guys to hear what recommendations that you have for your favorite East Bay books and authors. And then we can hopefully have a discussion about some of that material. I want to start off with this book, Oakland. Oh, and by the way, I should say, I'm going to compile a list of the books I'm talking about today and post it on my website so people don't have to be taking notes this whole time. I know there's going to be a ton of books that I'm mentioning, and people on social media. I asked yesterday on social media for people's recommendations, and I got so many responses, and a lot of people were saying it would be very helpful to have that list compiled, so I plan on doing that. That being said, I want to start with this book, Oakland, The Story of a City by Beth Bagwell. You can see right here Latham Square on the cover, where Broadway and Telegraph meet, heading down towards 14th Street here. You can see how much this intersection has changed over the last 100 years or so, but the fountain is still there. And the reason I want to start with this book is because it's such a great overview of Oakland history, especially kind of really going up to sort of mid-20th century. And then in the most recent edition, Erica Mailman, who was the history columnist for the Mont-Clarion, has a nice little update on the 80s and 90s. But this book is super helpful. Almost every episode or topic I look into, I can refer to this book and get some interesting information. And she covers so much territory. For example, a couple years ago, I was asked to do a presentation about beer history and brewery history in Oakland for Beer Week. I did that over at the Good Hop on Telegraph in conjunction with the Nerd Night people. And sure enough, this book even has a little section on beer history. So literally, it just covers every base you can imagine, and really well written and very comprehensive, and tons of good notes too. That's another good thing that I love about nonfiction history books, is you can go to the bibliography, of course, and see where the historians got their information, and it's very helpful for diving down that rabbit hole if you're doing research. Another book that I think is really important to understanding Oakland's history is this one, American Babylon, Race and the Struggle for Post-War Oakland by Robert O. Self. This came out in about 2004. And this is just really relevant for understanding really kind of economic patterns and housing patterns. Of course, the white flight phenomenon that had such an impact on Oakland, in terms of decreasing the tax base and changing the demographics of the city. This book really explains a lot of the kind of policy context around the things that led to those changes. For example, the government subsidies that led to suburban development, and the GI Bill and things like that. So it really kind of puts these trends that people in Oakland experience personally in a sort of larger context in terms of both city and state and federal policy, and also gets into a lot of the kind of nitty gritty between of political struggles, struggles for power in City Hall, the transition from the downtown, Noland family kind of Republican conservative power elite to the rise of people of color and more progressive politics and City Hall. This book really kind of traces a lot of the history of that and is really helpful for understanding how we got to where we are today. I've got to give a shout out to another local historian whose work I often refer to when I'm doing my research, and that's Gene Anderson, who I think is on this call, and did this book a couple of years ago called Legendary Locals of Oakland. And not only did Gene write this book, but he also is a frequent contributor to the Oakland Wiki, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with, but it's amazing. It's like Wikipedia, except just about Oakland things. And it's amazing. Anyone can contribute to it. It doesn't need to be historically significant. People have built Oakland Wiki pages for their grandparents, their favorite restaurant, things like that. And, just looking at the cover alone, I've done stories about Tina Tamale here. One of my first episodes was about her and her family. They owned La Borraqueña, which was one of the oldest Mexican restaurants. Dearly departed Mexican restaurants in old Oakland, the old Oakland area. We got William Shorey on the cover here, who of course was the only Black whaling captain in California history, and his house is a landmark in West Oakland now. And I did an episode about him back in the day. Who else is on here? Fabian Rodriguez, a great artist who has just gotten so prominent now. It's amazing to see how much he's blown up in recent years. So yeah, this is just little short biographies of people, about a paragraph or so per person, but covers a lot of territory. Got Fred Korematsu in there, of course. Love that photo of Fred. We got his gravesite at the bottom here, which is over in Mountain View Cemetery, which I really hope will be reopening again soon. One of my favorite places to go for walks in Oakland that's unfortunately been closed for the last couple of weeks, but understandably so. Let's see, another book that has come in really handy is this one, The East Bay Hills, A Brief History by Amelia Sue Marshall. Those of you who live in the hills or spend time in the hills, something that's really interesting is that a lot of the streets that are still in existence up in the East Bay Hills, and even the trails in the regional parks, started as logging roads when Oakland was a logging town, when there was a bigger population of people up in the Oakland Hills than downtown, because that's where the money was to be made. The East Bay Hills were really thriving, and the big industry, of course, was chopping down all those old growth redwood trees. I did an episode about this in my Long Lost Oakland series, and it's astonishing to think that between the mid 1840s and by 1870, say, pretty much all the old growth redwood trees in Oakland had just been wiped out tragically. For those of you who have been up to Humboldt County, for example, haven't seen what those giant old growth redwoods look like. It's just astonishing. I mean, we have some beautiful, beautiful redwood trees in Oakland. Don't get me wrong. I love going up to Redwood Regional, but they're really twigs compared to those giant, 2,000, 3,000-year-old behemoths that you see up on the North Coast. And it's just incredible to think about what Oakland would have looked like back then when you had these, 350 foot tall trees that were, 20 feet across. There is one old growth redwood tree left in Oakland, Old Survivor, which you can actually see if you go up to Carl Monk School and look down. There's a plaque kind of explaining the history of Old Survivor. But it's not very impressive. The reason why it's the only survivor is because it's kind of a runted little, stunted runt of a tree, and it's kind of gnarly, and it's sort of on the side of a ravine. So if they would have cut it, it would have been hard to drag out. It's surrounded by poison oak, so you can't really get to it. But hopefully the redwood trees that we have growing in Oakland now will continue to grow unmolested, and we will have, giant redwoods once again someday, in hundreds of years. So I mentioned earlier when we were just getting started on the call that I really missed the boat tours that I've been doing out on the bay. A bunch of you guys from the Rotary Club joined me on one of those boat tours last year. I remember that was a really fun one. We had some beautiful weather that day. And one of the books that was really helpful for doing my research for that, the boat tours I do one of Oakland and Treasure Island and Alameda, and then I just added another tour this year, or the end of last year, that goes up north towards, Richmond and that part of the bay. But this one, Down by the Bay, San Francisco History Between the Tides by Matthew Morse Booker, is a great overview of bay history that gets into everything from natural history to, the rise and fall of the oyster industry, the rise and fall of salt ponds, shell mounds, you name it. And one of the things I say on the tour at the very beginning of the boat tours that always kind of blows people's minds who don't know is the fact that we look out at the bay now and it looks just, like it's always been there, but it's really only about 10,000, 15,000 years old. When the first indigenous people came down to California, towards the end of the last ice age, there was still so much ice wrapped up or frozen at the polar ice caps and glaciers that the sea level of the Pacific Ocean was, way lower than it is now. So the ocean, the seashore of the Pacific Ocean was all the way up by where the Farallones is thousands of years ago. And the bay was really just kind of a river valley. And underneath where Golden Gate Bridge is now, there was like a waterfall dipping down. So just another thing that's really fun to imagine. And the bay has really been through a lot. Of course, it was completely devastated during the gold mining era by hydraulic mining, which was invented by Anthony Chabot, one of the inventors of hydraulic mining. A lot of you are probably familiar with the name Anthony Chabot, of course. Lake Chabot is named after him, Chabot Observatory, Chabot. There's a couple schools, Chabot schools, etc. And he definitely made some positive contributions to society, but unfortunately the invention of hydraulic mining, in my opinion, was not one of them. It was very effective for getting the gold out of the hills, but all that rubble that they blasted flowed down the streams and just completely demolished everything living on the bottom of the bay by essentially suffocating it, which laid the groundwork for a lot of the invasive species that you see in the bay these days. Because once those invasives got in there, they had a lot less competition from the natives because the natives had already been wiped out due to all that mining waste flushing into the bay. I think it was like 3 times as much material as was excavated from the Panama Canal was, flushed down from the Sierras in the 1800s. Of course, I can't talk about local history without talking about the Aloni people, the original inhabitants of the Bay Area who were here for thousands and thousands of years before colonization. And this book, The Aloni Way, by Malcolm Margolin, the founder of another great local publisher, Heyday Press, is a really fascinating book that's kind of a speculative look at what it would have been like to live here during the Aloni era. And I actually got to go to the 40th anniversary party for the release of this book last year at the City Club. I think, was it the City Club? One of those Berkeley institutions. And Malcolm was there along with Karina Gould and a lot of other Aloni elders and people from that community. And it's amazing because when this book came out, you still saw textbooks in California schools that basically said the Aloni people were extinct. They were totally wiped out. They were gone. But of course, there's been a huge revitalization and a giant surge of interest in Aloni culture in the last couple decades since this book came out. And now there's an Aloni cafe that serves indigenous food up in Berkeley. There is people who are learning the language again, bringing it back from the brink of extinction. People who are teaching traditional basket weaving skills through various programs. And it's just amazing. The Segorte Land Trust has a farm out in deep East Oakland where they're trying to reinstill some native gardening practices and things like that. Yeah, this book is totally monumental in the history of the resurgence of Aloni culture. So shout out to Malcolm Margolin for that. One of the questions that came in already through the RSVP form was, let's see, it was a question about, it says, there are so many books about the Black Panthers, where should I begin? And to answer that question, I would say a good place to start is this book, Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party by Joshua Bloom and Waldo E. Martin. There are indeed dozens and dozens of books about the Black Panthers. So many, former members wrote memoirs. There's been, very positive portrayals of the Black Panthers, very critical portrayals. Of course, they're very complex and, non-monolithic institution. There was a lot of different kinds of people involved, and they certainly went through many different waves. Oh, cool. I've got this bookmark in here of Boots Riley holding up this newspaper that I used to publish like 20 years ago. So another Oakland celebrity who directed that great movie, was it called Sorry to Bother You, a couple of years ago. But yeah, this book is a good overview. I feel like it does a good job at covering a lot of the different phases of the party, the kind of various threads. And importantly, it also doesn't only focus on their kind of, political celebrity and, the more macho militaristic aspects of the party, but also their social programs as well. The medical programs, the school breakfast programs, the Oakland Community School, which Erica Huggins was the principal of for many years. And I did an episode about a couple of years ago. And speaking of the social programs, this is another good one that's more focused on Oakland exclusively. Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California by Donna Jean March. And again, what she's really doing is focusing on kind of like the local community aspect of the Black Panther Party, as opposed to their kind of national, international profile, which a lot of the other books focus on. And of course, again, don't forget to RSVP for Lisa's event next week, where we'll be talking all about the Black Panther Party and the trial of Huey Newton, which of course was a seminal event in Oakland history. It's so crazy because you always see those photos of the Black Panther Party rallies in front of the Alameda County Courthouse. And then, you walk by the courthouse and it's right there, and it feels like you're kind of walking through history when you're just taking a stroll through downtown Oakland, because those images of people protesting on the steps of that courthouse have been in so many documentaries and films about the 60s. Kind of from the younger generation of writers, this book is actually hard to find now. Hopefully they're going to reprint it soon, but I've got to give a shout out to Pendarvis Harshaw. He wrote this little memoir a couple years ago called OG Told Me. He actually self-published it. I had to give him a call and meet him, and he sold me a copy right out of his backpack because he was really hustling. In true Oakland fashion, he was hustling. Got this book published himself. And there's tons of interesting memories about, going to school in Oakland, going to sideshows as a kid. But really the premise of the book, the reason why it's called OG Told Me is because he started a project where he went around essentially interviewing Black elders, Black men from the community from Oakland. And one of the reasons he did that is because he didn't grow up with a father. So he felt like, without having a dad, you really need to go out and seek the wisdom if you want to find it. And he did that, and he compiled a lot of the advice he got into this book. And he's continuing to do a lot of important writing about Oakland culture and arts in Oakland over at KQED Arts. And you can follow him over at OG Pen, OG Pen on Twitter. He also just did a great piece last month about the history of Soul Beat TV. Some of you guys who watched public access programming on Oakland TV in the 80s and 90s, probably remember Soul Beat. It was kind of like a local version of MTV crossed with a lot of, just like anyone could have a show on it, basically. Let's see, what else? Oh, another self-published book I want to give a shout out to, because, as an independent operator myself, I always got to respect people who are out there hustling. This one just came out a couple years ago. It's called Eastern Span. And this is a novel. It's a fiction book. It's kind of noirish. It's set in kind of the early 2010 era, the teens, I guess we would call it now. And this guy, Rick Paulus, was a great local journalist. Unfortunately, he couldn't really find enough work here to sustain himself, so he moved to New York. He's over on the East Coast now. But he had a really interesting marketing strategy for this book, which was that he realized that the cost difference between printing 1,000 copies and 2,000 copies actually wasn't that great. So he decided to print 2,000 copies and give 1,000 of those to the homeless people who sell street spirit. And he said that they could, sell the books for whatever they wanted and keep 100% of the profits. And that strategy actually ended up really working in Rick's favor, because so many people were interested in the book by seeing these people selling it that it really caught on by word of mouth. And he got a lot of publicity because of this unique marketing strategy. He got written up in the LA Review of Books and the San Francisco Chronicle and a bunch of other literary publications. So of course, authors are always trying to figure out how to, build some attention around their books. And Rick came up with a really unique strategy that not only helped him get known as an author, but of course helped the people that sell street spirit on the streets. And I think I talked to some people who sold it, and they said like they would get anywhere from usually $5 to $20 for a book. So not bad. I've got a whole nother stack here, and I can tell I'm starting to run short on time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'll burn through these ones quick. I hope I'm not overwhelming you, but I couldn't narrow it down to like 5 or 10 books. I just love all these books. I couldn't do this event without giving a shout out to this book about Ina Coolbrith, The Bittersweet Song of California's First Poet Laureate by Alita George. The very, very first episode of East Bay Yesterday, my podcast, I interviewed Alita about this book. And not only was Ina Coolbrith California's first poet laureate, but she was also the first librarian in Oakland, the first public librarian, I should say, back when the library was next to City Hall. And I've got a picture of it. Here, can you guys see that? This is what Oakland's first library looked like. You can't. Okay, yeah. And they, it's funny. Another thing that Ina Coolbrith is known for is she not only, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Just remembered though. She convinced Joaquin Miller to change his name. That's right. That's what I was going to say. When he came to Oakland, he was trying to make it as a poet, and his name was Cincinnatus Heiner. And she was like, I don't think that's going to work. You need something catchier. How about Joaquin Miller? And he was like, yeah, okay. That sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty good. So if Joaquin Miller wasn't friends with Ina, we might all be hanging out in Cincinnatus Heiner Park these days instead of Joaquin Miller Park. And, I was just up in Joaquin Miller Park a couple days ago, and it's such a beautiful resource. Although I do have to say it's unfortunate to see how much trash there is in the park these days. Really, really frustrating to see so much garbage piling up in Oakland's park. So, if you see people littering, say something, because it's not cool and it's a fire hazard. Another person that I interviewed in the podcast that I can't say enough good things about this person. She's just a dream, and one of the most incredible people I've ever talked to. Interviewing her was like a dream come true. But Betty Reed Soskin, America's oldest park ranger, she's 98, I want to say. somewhere up there, really, really old. She graduated from Castlemont High in Oakland, class of 38. That's right, class of 38. And like interviewing her just blew my mind. She was like telling me these stories about, you know, like roller skating down to Lake Merritt in like the 1930s. And the way that she described what Oakland was like back then, it's like a different planet. But she is, of course, known for giving her very powerful presentations up at the Rosie the Riveter National Park up in Richmond there, which is a really cool little educational facility if you haven't got a chance to go up there and check it out. And she's just a badass. She's been through so much, and yeah, I mean, she's a great writer too. This book is, it started off as a blog and people were so into it. They're like, you should turn this into a book. And I'm so glad she did. But again, just like a saint this woman is. And really, really incredible. Oh, and her family owned Reed's Records too, which was one of the first Black record stores in the Bay Area. Way back in the 1940s, they opened. They just closed last year, I believe. And yeah, they really kind of put a lot of local Black musicians on the map by selling their records before there was really any other outlet for that kind of music. Let's see. You know, this book really kind of blew my mind. Dorothea Lange, A Life Beyond Limits by Linda Gordon. I was familiar with Dorothea's work, but only like the Great Depression stuff, really. You know, we all know this picture, right? Migrant mother. It's just Mother's Day last weekend. Shout out to all the moms. My mom's actually on this call. Hi, Mom. But Dorothea Lange did tons of local photography, too. She started off as a portrait photographer in San Francisco, really taking pictures of really kind of the elite, the wealthy, the bohemians. And then during the Great Depression, she totally switched gears, started taking pictures of, you know, people who were down on their luck, poor people, homeless people, etc. And that really set her off on this path that led to her becoming one of the most renowned photographers of the 20th century. Her photos really kind of defined, you know, the visual history of the Great Depression. But on the local level, she would hang out outside of what's it called, Swan's Market, and take pictures of people coming out of the marketplace. She took this picture, which I'm going to get to this book later, but you know, pictures of people working in the shipyards up in at the Kaiser shipyards. She took pictures of so Lake Berryessa, before it was a lake, it's a reservoir now, essentially. But she actually took pictures of the town that was wiped out to create that reservoir. And it was like a really interesting example of early environmental photography. And she did a whole project about the criminal justice system in Oakland, actually, that's really startling because it's just, you didn't see photos like that back in the 1950s where people were kind of taking photos of law enforcement and courts in a way that maybe casts some, I guess, say skepticism on the way things were working. You can see a lot of those photos in the permanent exhibit that recently went up at the Oakland Museum of California when it reopens, of course. And they have thousands and thousands of photos of her that aren't on display, that are in their archives because they've got for collection. But I did an episode about Dorothea when the temporary Dorothea Lange exhibit went up at the Oakland Museum a couple years ago. And this woman was just, I mean, another incredible, inspirational artist. Another photo series that she did that I should mention is the Japanese, you know, people call them internment camps. Some people don't like that term. Mass incarceration perhaps is more accurate. But she took really, really startling pictures of what was really happening at those camps. And the government didn't like them, and they weren't released for a long time, but you can find those now online. And it shows really kind of just how desolate those institutions were, where they kind of, you know, took all the Japanese people from California and other parts of the West Coast and put them in these really ramshackle facilities out in the middle of the desert for several years. People who had, you know, of course, committed no crime, hadn't been charged with anything, just rounded up and isolated and detained because of their heritage. As long as I'm talking about, this book, there's a lot of great books about World War II era Oakland and Richmond. Of course, this is a time when the East Bay went through a massive, massive growth spurt. I think Oakland's Black population quintupled in about a decade between the 1940s and 50s. And a lot of those are more recent books, like historians that have gone back and compiled all this research and, kind of come up with their thesis on what they want to say. But this book is really unique because the woman who wrote it was like a sociology student at Berkeley and graduated when she was, 21, 22, whatever, whenever you graduate school. And instead of going into academia, she decided to get a job at the shipyard and at Moore Dry Dock, to be specific, which used to be at the foot of Adeline Street, near where they're talking about maybe doing the new A Stadium, like near the Howard Terminal site. And there used to be this giant shipyard there. I did a whole episode about it. She just, talks about this insane mix of people. There was Okies, there was, Black folks coming from the South, there was local folks. And it was just this crazy time when, imagine if Oakland's population like doubled in like 3 years, because that's basically what happened during the 1940s. And the shipyard was nuts. They had 3 shifts, going around the clock. It was never closed. I think there was 35,000 workers here at the height of activity. And they were just cranking out these giant ships for the war effort. And just really, really interesting behind the scenes look, not only at what it was like to be in the shipyard, but specifically what it was like to be a woman in the shipyard. Because of course, as we all know from the Rosie the Riveter Museum, this was one of the first times that a lot of women joined the more kind of industrial workforce. Of course, women have always been doing lots of work, sometimes unpaid labor, like housework and things like that, which is still very valuable and still work. But this is the first time, women were working side by side with men in giant factories. So of course, a lot of issues with, sexual harassment, discrimination, etc. And she really explains what it was like to kind of go through that and be a pioneer in terms of, they didn't even really call it feminism back then, but standing up for her rights as a woman to be treated equally. Just like, this is like a draft. You know what? I'll talk about this book next, actually, instead, because it's a little bit more on theme. Speaking of the war and various wars, this is a book that I've actually been looking at a lot lately. The Oakland Army Base. This is it's an oral history compiled by the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley about 10 years ago, 12 years ago now. And I picked up this book a couple weeks ago because for those of you who listen to the podcast, I just did an article or an episode about my grandparents. My grandfather was stationed at the Oakland Army Base in the early 70s, and my grandma volunteered there. And so when I started researching the base, I picked up this book, was totally fascinated by it. It interviews dozens of people, ILWU workers, civilians who worked in the kind of administration of the base, people from the military, community activists from West Oakland. You get a whole range of perspectives. And I was so impressed with this book, I decided to do a whole episode basically recreating this book in podcast form. So I'm hoping that episode is going to be out in the next couple days. And it's going to be a little bit different. It'll be sort of an audio collage of people sharing their memories of the Oakland Army Base, roughly from the 40s through about the early 2000s. The base was decommissioned in 99, I want to say. And some of the tape I found that the Oral History Center gave me permission to use is amazing. There's a woman describing being on her bike in West Oakland and seeing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ride by in a car with a delegation of high-ranking military officials because he was going to inspect the site to decide if it would be, the place where they would situate an army base, during the lead up to World War II. There's people who talk about what this area of Oakland was like back when it was just mudflats and marshes. So as I mentioned, these interviews for this book were done about 12 years ago, and the people who they interviewed, some of the people they interviewed for it have passed away since then. So it's amazing to hear these voices sharing their stories. And there's also a lot of more modern history in it too. There used to be a nightclub on the base called the Crosswinds Club. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but like apparently En Vogue used to hang out there. Famous Oakland singing group En Vogue. Some of you might remember such En Vogue hits as, let's see, Never Gonna Get It, What a Man. What else do they do? So many jams. En Vogue. Speaking of music, this is another fun one. I don't know if there's a lot of punk rock fans on this call, but this is another good oral history. I love oral histories, but this is called Give Me Something Better, the profound, progressive, and occasionally pointless history of Bay Area punk from Dead Kennedys to Green Day. And this, of course, covers a lot of Bay Area bands, not just East Bay bands, but there is a lot here on kind of the Gilman Street Lookout record scene, which spawned Green Day, of course, one of the biggest punk rock bands of all time, still around. I think they just put out some new music recently. But yeah, this talks about what Green Day were like back when they were just some, snot-nosed teenagers playing in this little basement-like venue for a bunch of other high school kids before they became, international rock stars. All right, so this one's a personal favorite that I use all the time. You maybe you can see it's pretty worn out. I carry this with me all the time. The Secret Stairs of the East Bay, a walking guide to the historic staircases of Berkeley and Oakland. Those of you who have been feeling cooped up lately and have been, avoiding the lake and some park trails because maybe they're too crowded, this book has a great list of, you can see I've got all my check marks here because I've done every single walk in this book. I know some of you are probably horrified that I'm writing in books, but I do it all the time. Not library books, though. If there's any librarians on the call, don't worry. But it's great little, maps with little history sprinkled in. This is the history of this block. This is the history of that block. One of the Berkeley walks, it's like, here's where, Ursula Le Guin's father, Alfred Krobler, lived, or here's where this happened, or here's where that happened. So good exercise, good history. Secret Stairs of East Bay. The same author who did this, Charles Fleming, also did one for LA. And I got that one, and it's like a really exciting way to explore LA because I don't really know that much about LA, and I didn't want to just go to the tourist places when I was down there. So I got the Secret Stairways book and ended up exploring tons of neighborhoods I never would have probably checked out if it hadn't been for the Secret Stairways book. How are we doing on time here? 6:36. All right, I'll wrap it up super quick. This is another good one, California's Guide to the Birds Among Us. I've been getting into birds lately. Got to give a shout out to my friend Jenny Odell, How to Do Nothing. She lives in Oakland and talks quite a bit about Oakland history in this book. The Rose Garden over by the lake, Morecambe Rose Garden, she talks about Old Survivor, the Middle Shoreline Harbor Park. She talks about that, and Chapel Hayes Observatory, which is one of my favorite places in Oakland. And this book did incredibly well. I interviewed her when this book first came out over at Wolfman Books in downtown Oakland. And, it's a tiny little bookstore. There's maybe like 30 people there. And by the end of the year, she was like famous because Barack Obama put this book on his list of top books of 2019 to read. And I couldn't be more happy for her. She's one of my bird watching buddies. Speaking of nature, this is a great one, A State of Change, Forgotten Landscapes of California. It covers all of California, not just the East Bay, but what Laura Cunningham does is she's like a scientist and an artist. So she will, she'll paint paintings, realistic looking paintings of what the Bay used to look like before colonization. So where's a good one? And she, really does the research to find out like what plants would have been here, what birds would have been here, what animals would have been here. This is an example of one of her paintings. This is like a marsh near present day Hayward. So it's just like these spectacular, and there's like a whole explanation for everything. She'll be like, this is what this grass was, this is what this bird was, just these gorgeous paintings of what the Bay Area used to look like. And so it's a really fascinating mix of science and art and history. And this is also a heyday book. They put out so many good books. There's a crazy, crazy painting in here somewhere of a bear crawling out of a whale, which apparently is based on a true story. Like, she was reading through these journals of explorers, and one of them actually saw like a whale carcass on the beach. and was like, what's going on with that whale carcass? And then a grizzly bear like emerged, like it had been eating the beached whale from the inside out. So yeah, crazy. Won't see that these days in California. Maybe in Alaska, I don't know. My collaborator on the long lost Oakland map, T.L. Simons, he laid out this book. It's called Visions of Peace and Justice. What this book is he used to work for a collective of printmakers called Inkworks, and so print shop. And so they printed tons and tons of posters for like political rallies and things like that in the 70s and the 80s, 90s. And for their, their 30-year anniversary, they compiled all their posters into a book. And so there's tons of posters for local events, local protests, etc. in this book. And it's just a gorgeous book of really cool local political posters and some little stories about the movements that spawned those posters as well. If you want something more like relaxing, like a lot of these books are kind of science-y or kind of intense about politics, etc. I read this over Christmas break this year. This was written by Francis Dinkenspiel. It's called Tangled Vines, Greed, Murder, Obsession, and an Arsonist in the Vineyards of California. And it's about, essentially the largest wine arson in history, which took place up on Merritt Island about 15 years ago. And Francis, who's the publisher of Berkeley Side, the online news site, had a personal connection to the story because some of her great-grandfathers, I think it was like sherry maybe, some kind of, liquid alcoholic beverage was like burned in the fire. And it's just full of crazy stories. And the reason why I'm including this in my list of East Bay books is because she talks about the history of Wine Haven, which, if you don't know, is used to be the biggest like wine making complex in America, and it's up in Richmond. The building is still there. It looks like an old castle. We actually passed by it on my Richmond boat tour. It's been the subject of a lot of redevelopment fighting for many, many years now, but it essentially was put out of business by Prohibition. And the story is that they hadn't sold all their wine in time, so they had to dump like thousands and thousands of gallons of wine into the bay. And so there was all these urban legends about fishermen catching drunk fish in the days afterwards because the fish were swimming around in like 20,000 gallons of wine. But yeah, it was like distillery, and they would ship the grapes in. It's like right on the railways, etc. It's just a really fascinating building. And then the Navy took it over, and it was a Navy facility for a long time, and now it's empty. There's a big battle over, if there's going to be residential development, if it should stay protected as parkland. A couple of years ago, there was a casino proposal that got shut down, but that is a really fascinating part of the Bay Area that not many people get to see because it's kind of in an obscure location. And lastly, this is actually a book I'm reading right now. Some of you have probably heard of it, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, the Samin Nosrat book. And it's like, okay, it's a cookbook. It's not just a cookbook. Samin is a really good writer. A lot of you probably saw her Netflix show, which was amazing based on this book. But in the beginning of it, she talks about her own personal history as a young chef at Chez Panisse, and then, getting to be friends with Michael Pollan and becoming Michael Pollan's cooking teacher and developing this whole theory about kind of like the chemistry and the physics of cooking. And I'm reading it now, and I like to cook, but I feel like this is changing my game like instantly. I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense now. And so there are recipes in it if you need recipes, but you can actually just like read it cover to cover as like a standalone book because it is, it's a really great read, and really cool illustrations too by Wendy McNaughton, who's a great local illustrator. I think she might be based in San Francisco, but another good local book. Let's see. There was a couple other questions that came in from the RSVP forum that I want to touch on. Favorite books about labor history in the East Bay. Let's see. This book, No There by Chris Romberg, gets into a lot of the history around the Oakland general strike of 1946. And there's another book that came out a year or two ago called Dock Worker Power. It's more focused on ILWU history. I ordered a book a couple months ago called American History in 10 Strikes. And one of the chapters in that book is about the Oakland strike of 1946. And I'm so mad because someone stole it off my doorstep before I got to read it. And I still don't have a copy, and I can't get one because the library is closed. So I'm still hoping to read that one. Let's see. Someone else asked about Jack London books that relate to Oakland. John Barleycorn is one. He writes a lot about, basically the history of his alcoholism. And that started when he was a young boy, drinking beer in Oakland at the age of like 8 or whatever it was. And then, drinking at Heinold's First and Last Chance Saloon over there in Jacqueline Square, etc. That's a pretty crazy book. More of like a kind of personal history is Martin Eden, which is a novel, but it's sort of based on his experiences as a young man from Oakland. And of course, there's Tales of the Fish Patrol, which Jack London wrote about his time. He started out as an oyster pirate, but then flipped sides and became like an oyster pirate catcher. So I actually haven't read Tales of the Fish Patrol. So if anyone has, maybe you can jump in and let me know if it's worth reading. But let's see, I think that's most of the questions. Someone else asked about like ideas about how to use the library now that it's temporarily closed. The library actually the Oakland Public Library just launched a podcast called Check Your Shelf. Check Your Shelf. That's the name of the podcast. And the new episode is all about kind of how they're dealing with, the current situation of the coronavirus pandemic and trying to still provide services for people, even though they can't have their doors open like they used to. So with that, I guess I'll open it up and see what kind of questions are coming through on the.
Oh, I feel very.
Yeah.
So we got one from Kristen. So she sews garments and embroidery and does embroidery in Berkeley, and she's curious to learn if there's any textile history in the East Bay and if you have any recommendations.
Yep.
Is he muted? Oh, why is he muted?
Liam, you got muted.
I did not.
Unmute. I don't personally know much about textile history in the Bay Area, but the people I would ask there's a couple quilting guilds. There's like the Oakland Quilting Guild that has done a couple art shows and has community meetings. I think they do their meetings even occasionally at the West Oakland branch of the library. But the Quilting Guild folks would probably know more about local textile history. And there's a show up at BAMFA, the Berkeley Art Museum. It's all about a local quilter who is Richmond-based, I believe. And so, if you talk to the curator of that show, I bet they would know a lot about local textile history. But I've got to admit, textile history is not my forte.
Nor many of the rest of us. And
okay, everyone's muted. We did in the RCPs get a question about your book, Liam. Do you have a book?
Oh, well, see, the thing about my book is I need to write it still. I really want to write a book. I am planning on it someday, but I just constantly, every time I finish a podcast, I just want to rush into making another one. So, I love the process of interviewing people and learning about new subjects. And I always feel like there's, just a couple more stories I want to do for the podcast before I start working on a book. And then that list keeps growing longer and longer. So one of these days, there will be an East Bay Yesterday book, but it is not currently being written. Soon, I think. Soon it will, but not yet.
Cool. You mentioned already your favorite labor text. History text.
I see a question just came in on the chat from David Peters. Hey, David, how's it going? I can't see you, but I know you're out there. David Peters, great local history fan. I went to a barbecue at his house last year. It was amazing. Some of the best steak I've ever eaten in my life. That's another super fun thing about doing this project is I get invited to lots of great parties these days. And like David's. And so he's asking about the California Hotel Project. Yes, really good question. So
that's a Dave Peters to Piedmont.
Those of you who have ever driven into Oakland from like the 580, you know that giant California hotel sign that you pass. That's just south of the highway there. It's a very historic building, and has a really interesting history too. And I had just started interviewing people for that episode when the coronavirus pandemic started, and so I put it on hold because the people who I want to interview in person. I don't want to do phone interviews for that one. I really want to sit down and kind of get into it with folks. And so that episode is on hold until, you know, it's safe to go into people's houses or have people over to my place and sit down and do those kind of long interviews that I like to do, and I'm working on an episode. But I've gotten a couple of good interviews already, and I'm confident that's going to be a really fun episode once it eventually comes together. Looks like there's a question about any riveting authoritative texts on the construction of Lake Merritt. I've got a friend who's actually working on a documentary about Lake Merritt right now. So like a video documentary. So that should be out hopefully within the next year or so. And that will cover a lot of Lake Merritt history. Beth Bagwell's book gets into it. For a lot of information on Lake Merritt, I would say go, once it reopens, go to the Oakland History Room at the Oakland Library. They have a couple folders on Lake Merritt. And another good place, if you can't wait that long, if you're just dying to know about Lake Merritt history right now, is go to the Oakland Wiki. Not only is there a robust entry on Lake Merritt on the Oakland Wiki, but also links to, you know, other articles or other topics connected to the lake, etc. So lots of Lake Merritt history out there, but there's not like one single book about the lake or anything like that as far as I'm aware. Although one of the suggestions that came in through social media was a book called People Are for the Birds, which was written by a former naturalist at Lake Merritt, Paul Cavell, who was a giant in the East Bay Regional Park System, you know, brought the park system, you know, a lot of great projects to the park system, I should say. But one thing he's a little bit notorious for is he's the person who introduced Canada geese to Oakland, which, you know, if you've ever stepped in the legacy of that project was not very happy. But yeah, oh, I should mention, I got so many, so I asked people about this on social media yesterday, what are your suggestions? And I got like a gazillion responses, but I'll just read a couple of the ones that are most common, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this too. So a lot of people chimed in to say There by Tommy Orange, of course, which was a huge literary smash hit a couple years ago, is one of their favorite East Bay books. A lot of people mentioned a book that I haven't read called Carter Beats the Devil. Gonna have to read that one now. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that, but Carter Beats the Devil apparently gets into, I think like Borak Smith is one of the characters in that book. It's a fiction book, but I think it's set in Oakland in the early 20th century. Blue City by Ishmael Reed got a lot of shout outs. I used to have a copy of that, but I let someone borrow it, never got it back. Let's see. To Place Our Deeds by Shirley Wilson and Moore. I've got a copy of that one somewhere. Where is that? It's somewhere. That's about African American history of Richmond, California. The 57 Bus, which is about a unfortunate attack of a trans student that took place on AC Transit a couple years ago. That book's by Dashka Slater. A lot of people like that one. Let's see. Linda Norton has a new book out called Whiteout, Love and Work, which I haven't read yet, but apparently has some Oakland stuff in it, and she lives over by the lake. Temescal Legacies is one that several people recommended. Jeff Norman was a local Temescal-based historian who put that book together and unfortunately just passed away last year. That is on my shelf, and I am planning on reading it. The Rice Room by Ben Fong Torres. There Was a Fire by Risa Nye, and you know, there's a ton of other suggestions that I'll put on the list when I post it. Telegraph Avenue by Michael Shabone was one that got a lot of recommendations, and yeah, there's so many books. So, I'd heard of a lot of them, but there was quite a few I hadn't heard of actually. So I'm excited to dig into this list too.
Cool. I think the only
I
other
want to point out there. Oh, sorry, Brandy.
Yeah, there was one question on long lost long lost Oakland maps, if they're still available, and where?
Yes, they are still available. It's funny, I had just dropped off a batch to the Oakland Museum to sell in their gift shop, like the week that the Oakland Museum closed. And so they're still there, sitting on the shelves that you can't get to yet, but I'm sure the Oakland Museum will reopen eventually. And they are similarly for sale at Wolfman Books down on 13th and Franklin in downtown Oakland. I don't think they're open right now either. At least they shouldn't be. Maybe they do like the curbside service thing that some other bookstores are doing now. But those are the places that you can pick it up these days. Or sometimes I do events. I was actually supposed to be doing an event at the Cal Academy of Sciences this month. It got canceled, of course, and I was going to plan on selling the maps there. So, subscribe to the East Bay Yesterday newsletter, and when I start doing in-person live events again, I'll be selling maps there.
Well, it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to go ahead and reach out to everyone and say, we did have mentioned that we were going to, offer up time to let everyone share their books, but given where we're at, I don't want to take too much. So instead, if you could email Oakland Uptown Rotary at gmail.com with your book recommendations, I'll go ahead and forward that to Liam. And since he's already compiling the books, in our next newsletter that we send out for Conversations in Oakland, we'll link back to his website so that everyone has access to the whole list and can fully get all the information. But I definitely want to leave room for 1 or 2 more questions if anyone has anything for Liam.
Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, feel free to unmute. You don't only have to use the chat. But if not, I really want to thank you, Liam, for all our speakers here. Rotary has a worldwide mission on the eradication of polio. And to thank you for speaking with us tonight, our club will be donating in your name to the Polio Plus to make sure that we continue that mission even during times of crisis like this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for all the great work you guys do. Thanks for having me. It's been such a pleasure to talk about some of my favorite books with the Rotary Club. And also thanks to everyone who's been chiming in on the chat with links and recommendations. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys again in person sometime when we can actually start having these meetings face to face, and we can actually clink our glasses for real next time instead of just the virtual toast.